Well, good morning. My name is Elmarie Parker, and it's a joy and gift to be here together in worship. I'm most often joined by Zoom, and I participate in a couple of our small groups, so it's always a gift to be able to actually be here. And I also serve with Church at the Park in the role of chaplain and pastor of spiritual care, working particularly with the family site up on Portland Road. Well, I invite us to hear God's word for us this morning through the Gospel of Matthew as it's found in chapter 13, starting in verse 24. But first, I want to offer a bit of context for us. So last week, Monica started us off in chapter 13, exploring the parable of the generous farmer who recklessly, some might say, sowed seeds into all kinds of soil. And she invited us to consider how our lives might hold one or more of these soils at any given time, and then offered us the encouragement of seeing the farmer's generous sowing of seed as God's hesed, something that we talk quite a bit about here at St. Thomas. God's hesed being God's unrelenting, unwavering, pursuing love towards us, no matter what soil a particular chapter of our lives might be experiencing. And in the text guiding our worship today, the writer of Matthew's gospel again invites us to hear a parable that Jesus is sharing with the crowd as they remain gathered by the lake. So picture your favorite Northwest lake and kind of the hillside approaching it, and there's a crowd gathered to hear Jesus speaking. I love that Jesus used these stories to spark a kind of aha moment. Parables are cousins to what was known as mashals in the Hebrew scriptures. And they were used by writers as a riddle to nudge discovery or understanding when confronted with the mysteries of God. I love that rather than kind of relying on this didactic, writing out all 4 points of what might be considered and having an intellectual debate, there was this invitation through story to begin to discover something deeper than what we might have known before. So leading up to this gathering by the lake, Jesus had been traveling from town to town, teaching and preaching and healing. And though there were many who were enthralled by him, he was getting on the nerves of the religious leaders of the day. And so they were going about trying to entrap Jesus in a variety of ways. And we can read about that in the chapters leading up to chapter 13. And the crowds themselves, they seemed more interested in the spectacle of miracles than actually recognizing and receiving the reality that in Jesus, God's kingdom, or maybe another way to think about it, God's dream for the world, for the cosmos, had arrived. And an unavoidable choice was emerging. Because Jesus was present, that first audience of Matthew's gospel were no longer waiting for God's kingdom to come. They were already living in it. And now the decision was facing them whether or not their actions and hearts would become like or be shaped by God's hesed, by God's shalom, by God's jubilee. All of those pieces were being demonstrated to them by Jesus in how he lived among them. They were living at the threshold of this invitation, would they first receive and then live God's hesed and shalom and jubilee towards neighbors and strangers and even enemies. And so Jesus tells another parable about the kingdom of heaven to spark an aha moment. And it goes like this, again found in Matthew 13, picking up in verse 24. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. So let them both grow together until the harvest, and at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Jesus then goes on and shares a couple more parables, and we'll have a chance to dive into those next week. And then he and the disciples come and enter into a home. So they are now no longer with the crowd at the lakeside. And his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." And Jesus answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are the angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I learned even more about weeds as I spent time with this text over the past couple of weeks. Growing up on a farm meant that dealing with weeds was a regular chore of mine. I can't tell you how many hours I spent pulling tansy plants out of our steer and horse pastures. Indeed, it does bad things to them if they eat it. But tansy is pretty easy to spot. It's very distinctive. The weeds in the parable that Jesus shares were not easy to spot, and hopefully there will be a picture showing that contrast. The weeds were actually technically called darnel, bearded darnel, and you can see how similar they look to wheat. Oh my goodness. That would be a backfire. So the poisonous grass, and it is poisonous, the seeds in it give off a toxin that causes major problems for people if they eat it. And it looks exactly like wheat when it is young. And it's not until both the wheat and the darnel mature that one can begin to spot the difference. On a wheat stalk, as the wheat matures, the head of grain gets very heavy, and so it begins to bend over. But with the darnel, the grains are very light, and so it stays upright. And so it's in that way that the farmers in the ancient world were able to tell the difference, but only once both the darnel and the wheat had matured. The other challenge that came with the darnel is that the way in which its root system worked is that it spread out and entangled itself with the roots of the wheat plants. And so you can begin to see why the farmer said, no, don't go around pulling up the darnel because you'll pull up the wheat as well. And so you have this system that has become intertwined with each other. The practice of an enemy sowing darnel into a rival's wheat crop was a common form of sabotage in the first century, and it was considered a serious crime. Under Roman law, the penalty was full financial compensation for the destroyed crop. So the offending neighbor had to pay the victim the highest possible value the crop would have had in that year. And so as Jesus was telling this story, the audience would have been very familiar not only with this form of sabotage, but also with the response of the farmer urging his workers to wait until the harvest in order to sort out the darnel from the wheat. But what may have caused that first century audience to pause is both the force of how the farmer said no and the fact that there is no mention in the parable of pursuing a case against the enemy in order to seek compensation. This is where the Greek helps me to see the force of that no more clearly than our English translation does. The farmer actually uses a double negative, and it would come across in the English as meaning no, not for the fear that. So verse 29, instead of what we read in the English, so let me read it again. No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. If we were doing a literal translation of the Greek, it would sound more like this. He said, no, not for fear that in gathering the weeds you would uproot them with the wheat. And so there's that extra emphasis on not pulling up the weeds. There's an urgency in the farmer's no, not. The farmer wants the wheat to mature. That's the farmer's goal. He is willing to patiently wait for the harvest. And he definitely does not want his workers to pull up the weeds until the harvest is ready. Well, Jesus later gives the disciples the interpretation of this parable because they ask for an interpretation of the parable. And of course, church communities over the ages have added their interpretations to the interpretation that Jesus gives to the parable. I'm sure for any of us who grew up in one church or another, we may have even right now going through our heads what we were taught about this parable. So once again, this is where I found the Greek to be helpful. When Jesus says that the field is the world, he uses the word cosmos. The ancient Greeks used this word to describe anything that was well assembled, from a disciplined troop of soldiers to the harmony of the whole universe. And then over time in the ancient world, it evolved to capture both the complex, harmonious, and orderly system of the universe, and then more specifically, the earth, the physical world, and every human family that inhabits the earth. Somehow when I hear that, the word cosmos carries much larger implications for me than simply the word world. Say that fast 5 times. It fires up my imagination. Jesus sowing good seed nourished by God's hesed, that unrelenting, unwavering, pursuing love of God towards us and all of the cosmos. Think how huge that is. All of the cosmos. Seed maturing to bear the fruit of God's shalom in us, of right relationship between God and ourselves and neighbor and creation. And God's jubilee among us, where everyone has enough, where abundance mindsets reign supreme, and we all are willing, as we read in Acts 2, to give freely of our possessions to fulfill God's desire for all people. I find freedom in Jesus acknowledging the reality that though this good seed has been generously sown, there is a rival being, though not an equal being, that is jealous of all this beauty, and so sows the things that are toxic to the seed seeking to be nourished by God's hesed, toxic to the practice of shalom and jubilee for which God yearns. These toxic things have roots that grow entwined with the roots of the good seed, and it's insidious in how it grows up, looking deceptively like God's hesed, God's shalom, God's jubilee, and yet it's not. The freedom I experience is in Jesus's double negative, no, not for fear that. That somehow in that mystery of the darnel, the toxic things growing up with the wheat, that there is a sense of life still happening, and that God's focus is on that life coming to full maturity. So here's my what if invitation for us today. What if Jesus' double negative offers us a profound permission to stop being the purity police, or stop feeling like we have to be or should be or ought to be the purity police, to stop carrying the burden of setting all things right towards ourselves, towards others, towards the community, towards the wider society. What if that double negative invites us into a wild patience, the same kind of wild patience of God's hesed, God's unrelenting love, where our only job is to stay at the table together with others and to keep widening the table, to keep offering hospitality, to keep holding space for the messiness and complexity of our individual and collective stories, and to keep trusting, leaning in that Jesus is in fact wise enough and strong enough to hold the whole field and to sort everything out in the end. Or said another way, what if our job isn't to purge the field of every systemic injustice and fall prey to perhaps causing an unknown injustice along the way, but rather to stay close to the sower and become even more deeply shaped by the sower's hesed, to humbly hold space for the mess, and to patiently co-cultivate conditions with God's Spirit where our whole neighborhood, our whole community, our whole society can in fact come alive with God's shalom and jubilee. Even as I offer those what if invitations, I can feel myself asking a million, but what about questions. Or I feel the advocate side of me resisting what seems to me a kind of surrender to the weeds, to the darnel. Maybe this and other kinds of questions are coming up for you as well. And I hope that we can talk and wrestle with each other over what this parable raises for us. What might be the aha invitation for us? And I hope at the end of the day, we can discover together more of what it means in practical ways to step more deeply into the wild patience of God's hesed, God's unrelenting love. It takes my breath away. And to patiently co-cultivate conditions where God's Spirit, with God's Spirit, where our whole neighborhood, our whole community, our whole society can, in fact, come alive with God's shalom and jubilee. May it be so.